Benito Mussolini's end was one of the most humiliating in modern history. In 1943, his own fascist Grand Council voted him out of power. He was arrested, but soon rescued by German commandos and installed as a puppet ruler of the so-called Republic of Salo in northern Italy. By 1945, that fragile regime was crumbling as Allied troops and Italian partisans closed in. Mussolini and his mistress Clara Petacci disguised themselves and tried to flee to Switzerland, hoping to catch a plane to Spain, where Francisco Franco's dictatorship still held. But near Lake Como, they were captured by communist partisans. The next day, in the small village of Giulino di Mezzegra, both Mussolini and Petacci were executed by machine gun fire, most likely at the hands of Walter Audizio. Their bodies were taken to Milan, dumped on the ground, beaten, spat upon, and finally strung upside down at a service station in Piazzale Loreto, where enraged civilians hurled stones at them, a brutal reversal for a man who once demanded worship like a god. Nicolae Ceausescu, the Romanian communist dictator, ruled with one of the most repressive regimes in the Eastern Bloc. His secret police, the Securitate, terrorized citizens, and his policies of forced urbanization and crushing censorship left the country impoverished. By December 1989, revolution had erupted. Ceausescu tried to rally support with a mass speech in Bucharest, but the crowd turned on him, booing and chanting against his rule. As protests swept across Romania, the army defected to the side of the people. Ceausescu and his wife Elena fled by helicopter but were captured soon after. On Christmas Day, December 25th, a swift military trial sentenced them both to death. Ceausescu shouted that he was still the legitimate president, but his words were drowned out by the crack of over 100 bullets. Their bloodied bodies on the ground marked the violent end of decades of oppression. Hideki Tojo, Japan's wartime prime minister, was held responsible for leading the nation into catastrophic war and for the atrocities committed across Asia. After Japan's surrender in 1945, American troops surrounded his home. Rather than face capture, Tojo attempted suicide by shooting himself in the chest, but missed his heart. Bleeding heavily, he apologized for failing to die quickly and insisted that Japan's war had been righteous. American doctors saved him, only to put him on trial. Found guilty of war crimes, he was hanged in December 1948. In his final statement, Tojo asked for mercy on the Japanese people, even as he accepted his own punishment. Kim Jong-il, North Korea's dear leader, cultivated a personality cult while his people starved through famine. By the 2000s, rumors swirled of his declining health. He was said to be paralyzed by strokes, his face bloated and frail. Still, propaganda videos insisted he remained vigorous. On December 17, 2011, state media finally announced his death from a heart attack while traveling on a train. The announcement was surrounded with myth, the sky glowing red over Mount Pektu, ice on a sacred lake cracking loudly as if the heavens themselves mourned. Kim was posthumously declared the eternal leader of North Korea, ensuring his shadow lingered even in death. Those shadows starved to death. Joseph Stalin, the architect of Soviet terror, spent his final years increasingly paranoid. He purged his doctors, accused them of conspiracy, and trusted almost no one. On March 1st, 1953, he collapsed on the floor of his dacha. For days, he lay semi-conscious, spoon-fed while his underlings whispered outside the room, too afraid to intervene decisively. On March 5th, he died of a massive cerebral hemorrhage. His funeral drew immense crowds, so many that people were trampled to death in the crush. Though officially blamed on natural causes, rumors persisted that his closest allies, especially Lavrenti Beria, allowed him to die, or even poisoned him, to free themselves from his iron grip. Pol Pot, the Khmer Rouge dictator of Cambodia, oversaw the deaths of nearly 2 million people in the so-called killing fields. By the 1990s, his grip on the movement was unraveling. He ordered the murder of a comrade, Sun Sen, and his family, sparking outrage among his own ranks. His rival Tamok placed him under house arrest. In one final interview, Pol Pot claimed his conscience was clear, denying the scale of the genocide. But when he learned he might be handed over to international justice, he reportedly took a lethal mix of Valium and chloroquine. On April 15, 1998, he died in his sleep. His body was cremated hastily on a pile of tires, leaving the world without a trial to fully account for his crimes. Saddam Hussein, Iraq's ruthless dictator, invaded neighbors, used chemical weapons, and crushed dissent. After the United States invasion in 2003, he vanished, becoming the ace of spades on America's most wanted deck of cards. In December, soldiers found him hiding in a tiny underground spider hole near his hometown of Tikrit. Disheveled and armed only with a pistol, he did not fire. Saddam surrendered, declaring himself still the president of Iraq. Tried for crimes against humanity, he was sentenced to death. On December 30th, 2006, he was hanged. The execution secretly filmed and leaked online. For a man who once styled himself as the new Nebuchadnezzar, his end was pitifully small. Francisco Franco ruled Spain as a fascist dictator for nearly 4 decades. His regime was built on repression, censorship, and mass executions after the Spanish Civil War. By the early 1970s, his health was failing. He officially named Prince Juan Carlos as his successor and finally died on November 20th, 1975, at the age of 82. His funeral was a massive state affair, but decades later, his legacy remained divisive. In 2019, Spain's government exhumed his remains from the Valley of the Fallen, arguing that a dictator should not lie in a memorial meant for Civil War victims. His coffin was reburied quietly in a family cemetery, stripped of state honors. Josip Broz Tito, leader of Yugoslavia, managed to hold together a fragile federation of different peoples, but ruled it as a communist strongman. In his final years, he suffered severe circulation problems. Doctors urged amputation of his infected leg. Tito resisted, threatening suicide, but eventually agreed. The operation came too late, the infection spread, and on May 4th, 1980, he died at the age of 87. His funeral was one of the largest in history, attended by leaders from both sides of the Cold War, a rare moment of unity, yet his death also marked the beginning of Yugoslavia's unraveling into bloody wars. Augusto Pinochet, the Chilean general who seized power in a coup in 1973, oversaw torture centers, mass killings, and thousands of disappearances. By 2006, he was under house arrest facing charges for human rights abuses. On December 10th, he died of heart failure at 91. His death split Chile. Some mourned, but many more celebrated in the streets, banging pots and pans in joy. Even at his funeral, anger boiled over when a victim's relative spat on his coffin. For his supporters, he was a savior from communism, but for his victims, he was a murderer who escaped justice. Mao Zedong, founder of Communist China, launched campaigns like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, which caused tens of millions of deaths. By the mid-1970s, he was frail and sick, suffering from heart and lung problems. In 1976, a series of heart attacks left him incapacitated. He died on September 9th at the age of 82. Though Mao had requested cremation, his body was embalmed and displayed in a glass sarcophagus in Beijing, where millions still file past to this day. His image continues to dominate China, even in death. Fidel Castro, who brought communism to Cuba, survived over 600 assassination attempts. But in 2006, a serious illness forced him into surgery, and he handed power to his brother, Raul. He never returned to office. Castro lived quietly for another decade, occasionally appearing in photographs, his once fiery speeches replaced by frail letters. On November 25th, 2016, he died in Havana at 90 years old. Unlike Mao, his wish for cremation was honored. His ashes traveled across Cuba, greeted by crowds, before being laid to rest in Santiago de Cuba. And finally, Adolf Hitler, the architect of the Second World War and the Holocaust. By April 1945, Berlin was encircled. Hitler, raving in his underground Führer bunker, refused to surrender. He lashed out at his generals, called his people traitors, and fantasized about salvation that never came. On April 29th, he married Eva Braun. The next day, with Soviet shells shaking the city, Hitler shot himself while Braun took cyanide. Their bodies were carried upstairs, burned with gasoline, and reduced to ash in the garden of the Chancellery. The Reich collapsed within days. Hitler, who had demanded the world bow to him, left behind only ruins, death, and a legacy of horror. From Mussolini's public execution to Gaddafi's chaotic downfall, dictators may rise with promises of glory, but they almost always fall into humiliation, exile, or death. Power built on fear cannot last forever. History makes sure of that.